Okay, we should be good to go.
All right, let's go for it. And thank you everyone for joining us for the first colloquium of the fall semester. So great to see many of you. And I'm going to say it's really just a special treat for me because we're doing land atmosphere to start the colloquium off. And as you all know how much I seem to be obsessed with the surface of the earth and trying to convince all of you how important it is for understanding weather and climate. It's an honor for me to be able to introduce a speaker who's going to tell you a bit about just that. And that is Kirsten Findell. Kristen Findell, and she is at Princeton's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory of NOAA. Where she is a land atmosphere expert and works on that and global climate processes. For those who aren't, I think everyone here is probably familiar with GFDL, but if you're not, it is one of the premier research laboratories of NOAA that provides quite a bit of expertise, and particularly with Earth system modeling and a variety of climate processes. Dr. Findell got her undergraduate degree at Princeton in geological engineering and her PhD in hydroclimatology from MIT. She was then a postdoc at GFDL and then stayed on and became a staff member in 2002. As we'll hear about a little bit, her work broadly looks at the role of the land surface in the climate, particularly with aspects of convective triggering, and well as kind of thinking about land use change and deforestation, flooding, drought, and all of the variety of ways that weather and climate impact our land surface. She's also a contributor to the World Climate Research Program through co-chairing of the Global Land Atmosphere System Study, or GLASS panel of GWEX, the Global Energy Water Exchange Project, and is co-chairing a new activity right now in exploring predicting Earth system change. So today we're going to hear a little bit about that work. If you want to go ahead and share your screen, you can get your title slide up. And I'll hear about land atmosphere interactions and the changing hydrologic cycle. And I'm going to turn it over to you. I will monitor chat to see if anything comes in, but go ahead and take it and go from there.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ankur, and thanks for inviting me to be here today. I'm really happy that I can come and speak about some of this research that I'm really excited about. So when we talk about the global hydrologic cycle, there's lots of information that we can cover, but the key piece that I want to send you home with today is about this new phase space that I'm really excited about, and it's based on soil moisture and climatological aridity. And it's really helpful at understanding hydroclimatic relationships and change, and how those relationships and how they're manifesting in terrestrial hydroclimate is really largely determined by these behavioral regimes that are defined by the relationship between soil moisture and latent heat flux. So that's going to be at the core of my talk today. And this is work that was really led by postdoc Suchin Dwan when she was working with me and Stefan Fugestaller while she was postdocing at GFDL in Princeton. So, but I'm going to start with a little bit about what we already know about how the hydrologic cycle is changing in a warming world. And then after I teach you or tell you about this phase space, talk about some of the extensions of that phase space in ways that we can better understand the terrestrial hydroclimate. So what do we know? Well, anytime we talk about the hydrologic cycle in a warming world, we of course have to start with the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship, right? This relationship that tells us how saturation vapor pressure is related to temperature, and tells us that there should be about a 7% increase in saturation vapor pressure with each degree of warming, right? So one of the key papers that sort of looked at the consequences of that Clausius-Clapeyron relationship is this fundamental paper by Isaac Held and Brian Soden that came out in 2006, where they showed that, of course, with the increased saturation vapor pressure, you're going to get increased column integrated water vapor, increased mean residence time of that atmospheric water vapor, and importantly, an amplification of the pattern of P minus E as temperatures increase. So precipitation minus evaporation, you can think of it as, precipitation is what's coming in, evaporation, what's going out at the land surface, right? So that moisture availability, if we look over here, whoops, let me pull up a pointer options, laser pointer. So here's the climatology of P minus E from a different study, but what we see is if we look at this black line, you see areas around the equator and slightly sort of mid latitudes where the precipitation is in excess of evaporation. But then you see at these lower latitudes, just off of the equator, areas where evaporation exceeds precipitation. So what Heldon-Soden showed was that you can approximate the change in P minus E by just scaling the climatological P minus E and multiplying it by the delta T times 7%. That's what the dashed line shows. And it's a pretty good approximation of what the models are showing. But an important piece to remember, but this generalized, this nice behavior led to a generalized phrase, the wet get wetter and the dry get drier, right? Which is a very easy phrase to state, so it gets used a lot. Here's a place where ocean salinity reflects that amplification. So this was a paper led by Paul Durack, where he looked at ocean salinity records and shows that indeed that does hold over the oceans. But that brings me to a really important caveat for land. When thinking about this over land, Heldon-Soden, when they talked about this, they showed that this paradigm is relevant for stationary circulation and where moisture is always available for evaporation, right? So that's really over the oceans, right? It's over the oceans as well as over well-watered land regions. But we know that the land is not always well-watered, right? So one of the things that I want to show you today is how this phase space that I'm going to introduce can help us understand how we might be able to think about P minus E or that the wet gets wetter paradigm in a way that's more relevant for land. But first, I want to talk about one more piece of sort of the underpinnings of what we know about how the hydrologic cycle is changing in a warming world. And that's about some connections between ocean and land. So Mike Byrne and Paul O'Gorman, they have a series of papers, but this one in 2018, they named this an ocean influence theory, where they linked trends in terrestrial temperature and humidity to ocean warming with two sort of basic constraints. One, just an atmospheric dynamic constraint, that if you look at the tropical region and you say, okay, well, changes in moist static energy are pretty quickly circulated around the tropics, and those must be equal over land and over ocean. So the manifestation of T and Q, of temperature and humidity, how those change over ocean and land can be different. But the moist static energy that results from those changes in T and Q must be equal over land and ocean. Then they also had this atmospheric moisture constraint, where essentially the ratio of specific humidity over land to that over ocean has to remain constant. So what they showed with this ocean influence theory is that they can, to first order, that's an important caveat, to first order can predict terrestrial temperature and humidity for a given ocean warming. But I'm going to push back on it just a little bit there, because this theory suggests that the response over land is really controlled by changes in ocean temperature and just modulated by the present day dryness of the land surface, but that the land response to warming doesn't play a role. So I'm going to give you, I hope through this new phase space, a sense of how that land response to warming does, in fact, play a role. But before we get to that, I want to talk just a little bit more about this contrast between ocean and land, and about how hydrologic exchanges between ocean basins and continental basins is changing in a warmer world. So if I look at just these sort of basic first order, you know, evaporation from ocean, evaporation from land, and then precipitation onto land or onto ocean, what determines the magnitudes of each of these terms in the hydrologic cycle? And can we look at how they might change in a warming world? Well, I did this a few years ago using model output from GFDL's model ESM2G, so the Earth System Model 2, with the G is for the gold ocean model, so that it was coupled to at the time. And I used output from this GFDL model with a water tracking algorithm written by Ruud van der Ent, who's in the Netherlands. And we can use that algorithm to essentially track moisture forward or backward to think about where it originated from. So if we think about precipitation on land, we can use this water tracking algorithm. It's this essentially just taking model output at various time steps and looking at the winds and the humidity and seeing what the last source region was. So for land precipitation, you can break it into two components: a component that's coming from other continental regions, or a component that's coming from oceanic evaporation. And we can define a continental precipitation recycling ratio that's essentially just the portion of the total precip that comes from continental evaporation. okay? And we can then sort of do this analysis, this water tracking for every grid point from a data set. And in the top case here, I've got a reanalysis data set, ERA interim. The middle, it's a different reanalysis data set, MERA. And then on the bottom is our ESM2G, the GFDL model. And what all of these show us is that the continental precipitation recycling ratio is, as might be expected, it's larger in downwind and edges of continent than at upwind edges of continent. I mean, we know that at the end, in the Pacific Northwest, much of that precipitation is of oceanic origin. So it's not a surprise. It's actually a nice confirmation of our expectations, what this map is showing. And there's nice correspondence, they're all in the same ballpark of about, 37, 38 to 42% is coming from continental sources. So we can also then look at evaporation and track evaporation forward and say, okay, evaporation from the land can either then eventually fall back out as precipitation on land, or it can be transported off over to the ocean and fall back down over the ocean. And again, we can develop this continental evaporation recycling ratio. And we again see that the two reanalysis products and the model are in the same ballpark of each other, 55, 56, 57% is recycling back onto land. So now what can we say about the future, about how those exchanges might be changing in the future? So before I look at the model to do that, I want to use just a sort of simple prototype to give us a sort of back of the envelope feel for how these changes might be occurring. So in this simple prototype, just imagine an atmospheric column, which has moisture originating from two sources, oceanic and continental. And so we can, for some initial time, compute this initial continental evaporation recycling ratio. And then imagine a later time, a future time where the temperature has increased and so essentially the atmospheric moisture holding capacity has expanded. The additional moisture that's held now is some portion is from continental origin and some portion is from oceanic origin. Well, we can just do essentially just some simple arithmetic to tell us that as long as the rate of change of oceanic evaporation is larger than the rate of change of continental evaporation as temperatures are increasing, then these continental moisture recycling ratios must go down. Okay, the future must be smaller than the initial, but it's those rates of change that are key. But we know that because there is soil moisture limitation on land and not over the ocean, that means that indeed that caveat is held and these ratios must decrease in a warming world. But the question is, can we look at the ESM2G and quantify a rate of that decrease? And in fact, we get a pretty consistent result from ESM2G when we compare the end of the 20th century to the end of the 19th century, as when we look at the end of the 21st century to the end of the 20th century. We see that in both of these cases, the later time period has a smaller recycling ratio, continental recycling ratio. And again, this is very consistent with just the simple prototype, and it makes sense. But our general ballpark is that these recycling ratios decrease by about 2 to 3% with each degree of increase in global temperatures. So that tells us that that the oceanic imprint on continental hydrology is getting bigger. But does that mean that the land doesn't matter? Of course not at all. We've got lots and lots and lots of studies that demonstrate the importance of land, particularly in things like temperature and humidity and extremes on land. So the land surface condition, the vegetation state, the soil moisture state is really important. So here's just a study where I demonstrate that by looking at the difference between a historical simulation, which includes the historical trajectory of land use and land cover change. And I compare that to what we call a potential vegetation scenario. That potential vegetation scenario has all the historical forcings they're all the same, except the land use is not the historical trajectory of land use change. Instead, it's what we call potential vegetation, the vegetation that would be present in a given location if humans hadn't altered the land surface. So what this ends up being in many locations is really a deforestation scenario, conversion of forests, chopping down forests where lots of people live to have agriculture, right? That's what the model is essentially simulating. And what we see is that if we look at the mean in these simulations, The areas where there was the greatest deforestation with less forest cover, those summertime means are hotter and drier. So the red here is indicative of this is I call it my color bar, a color grid rather than a color bar, where on the x-axis of this color grid, this is a humidity term, and on the y-axis is the temperature term, but they're put into equivalent energetic units. So the red is indicating that that there's warming and drying. So that's the mean state. But we can also use these simulations to look at individual heat extremes, heat and humidity extremes. So what I'm showing here are, again, these are mixing diagrams, which are in this two-dimensional conserved energetic space, where here I've got humidity normalized, or humidity converted into energetic units on the x-axis, and temperature converted into energetic units on the y-axis. And each of these is this is for a grid cell that's sort of in the middle of this red region here, so where we expect to see a difference. And each of these is a monthly mean diurnal cycle for the month of July. So these simulations, I had a couple ensemble members, each with a bunch of years. I got 50 years total here. So these are 50 Julys. And these little loops are from 7 a.m. up through, and each dot is an hour. The magenta is late afternoon, when we expect, to really be feeling the heat and humidity. And then it goes down cooling through the night into 6 a.m. at the end. So what we see is that over the crop covered scenario, you have many, many excursions into this hot, dry part of the parameter space. And these are monthly means, so monthly mean diurnal cycles. So that's a very different month than over here in the forested scenario, where most of the time the conditions remain much cooler and higher relative humidity. So then we can look at this and think in terms of the moist enthalpy, and we can think in terms of, okay, how often do we cross different thresholds in each of these two experiments? But we can also look at a hot dry measure, which is sort of orthogonal to that moist enthalpy. And we can look at, again, how many times, so this green line is constant hot dry measure for the forested scenario, the potential vegetation scenario, and the black is the 90th percentile for the hot dry measure for the crop covered, or the all historical scenario. So what this tells us, if we do this for every grid point, we see that in these regions with red here, what we're seeing is that in these altered regions, what would have been a once in a decade hot dry summer in the potential vegetation world actually occurs every 2 to 3 years in the historical simulations. So land surface is critically important in ways that people feel, right? People live in these locations. So how hot and dry the summers are matters to society, has societal impact. Okay, early on I mentioned this notion of the wet get wetter paradigm, right? And I did mention that, that the paradigm was really developed over oceans. And the big difference between oceans, and one of many big differences, is that over oceans, this P minus E term can be positive or negative. Here's the climatology, and the black line is everything. The blue line is oceans only. And you can see the ocean is sort of an amplified version of the black line. But the green is just the climatology over land. And of course, it makes sense that the P minus E can only be positive, right? P is coming in, but that's the only source for evaporation. But some of that P can be removed by runoff as well. Some of that precipitation can be removed by runoff. So Sonia Senavarotny and Peter Grieve have looked at in a couple ways to try to say, does this wet get wetter paradigm hold on land? And they concluded, no, if we look at annual means, these changes really don't make sense. And that 2015 result was an extension of this 2014 result, where they looked at observationally based data sets, and they showed that, okay, they called it dry get drier, wet gets wetter. They said for about 45% of land area, yeah, you can say that it makes sense, but that leaves like 55 or 60% where it's invalid. So what I want to do today, what we want to do with this work is try to make more sense of how the hydrologic cycle is changing on land, and formulate a way of looking at these hydroclimatic changes on land that can provide more information. So I'm going to do two things differently. We're going to use daily data rather than monthly or annual averages. And the reason that daily data are really, those data are so important is that it allows us to focus on the mechanistic processes that are really at the heart of land-atmosphere interactions. Okay, so this is, I'm just going to introduce the structure of this phase space and then get into it in more detail. So this phase space is based on the x-axis being daily soil moisture in percentiles. Okay, so this is a daily, so this is sort of like time, variation in time. Okay, and then the y-axis is a climatological aridity index. So this is like variation in space. And it's an indication of, for a given aridity index, it tells us, okay, at those locations, this is something, tells us something about the relationship between the amount of incoming radiation compared to the amount of precipitation. So very arid regions where there's an excess of radiation are our deserts. So those are going to be up at your highest AI percentiles. And very humid regions are going to be at very low AI percentiles. And those are your tropical rainforests. Okay, so this y-axis is our space dimension. The x-axis is time. Now, let me tell you why. So at the heart of this phase space is this nonlinear relationship between soil moisture and evapotranspiration. So this in and of itself is not groundbreaking and not new, but I think it provides a context for everything that's coming in this talk. So I want to go through it in detail here. So apologies if I'm saying stuff that you all already know. So there are 4 different regimes within this nonlinear soil moisture ET relationship. Of course, when it's too dry, there's no latent heat flux. There's no evapotranspiration. But you add a little bit more soil moisture and you start to get to the point where additional soil moisture means additional latent heat flux. So this we call the transitional regime. And both of these regimes are water limited, right? Water is determining how much evaporation you get. If you get a little bit higher, then you cross some critical point, at which point water is no longer your limiting factor. Now it's energy that's your limiting factor. And that critical point can be at different locations, both in space and time, but this transitional regime is where the vegetation and soil properties become really important, right? Soils might determine something about the ability of plants to pull up water that they'll then transpire. But the rooting depths, the rooting characteristics are variable in time, right? So they're variable in space, but they're also at a given location, they're variable in time. So what we're depicting here with this transitional regime is that often early in the growing season, when you have very short roots, it takes a lot of soil moisture before you start seeing latent heat flux. But later in the season, the same amount of soil moisture in your measured layer, which in everything I'm going to talk about today, I'm using 10 centimeters as a depth. But these roots can go deeper than 10 centimeters, right? So we can have additional latent heat flux that sort of kicks in earlier, kicks in at lower soil moisture values. So this is a complicated and messy space. And indeed, here's the schematic is kind of nice, but kind of simple. But actual data, it's much messier. But we do see evidence of this is for a single grid cell in Southern Africa. If we look at 30 years of data from this GFDL model, again, soil moisture in the top 10 centimeters. This is from a pre-industrial control experiment. And we're just focusing on the 5-month warm season. And what we see is you do see this transitional regime. This is sort of early in the season. And then later in the season when the roots are deeper and accessing deeper stores of soil moisture. And then here's the sort of the energy limited regime. And this over here is what we call an active rain regime, where it's no longer soil moisture is not the limitation here, it's energy, and it's because here there's a reduction in both incoming available R net radiation and a reduction in latent heat flux. Okay, so here's that's my messy data. Each dot is an individual day, and the color of each dot is the daily maximum temperature. So there's a nice correspondence where we see, of course, the lowest temperatures are where, in this active rain regime. The highest temperatures are in these water limited days, which really makes sense. It really makes sense that when there's not enough water available for available energy to be consumed by evapotranspiration, then all the excess goes just into heating up the air. okay? But that's going to become important. So remember, I'll come back to that frequently. Okay, so this is, again, from a pre-industrial control experiment, but now I'm going to try to simplify that messy picture there a little bit. And I'm going to consolidate the data into bins. I'm going to first organize the soil, rather than thinking in terms of soil moisture and the absolute value, I'm going to think in terms of percentiles. And the reason that that's helpful is because it can help us gauge the percent of time that given grid point is in each of these regimes, okay? But what it also allows us to do, so we can bin all the data in these messy points and do that, but we can also then compare experiments and see how that sort of distribution in the different regimes, the percent of time spent in each regime changes. So the black line is the pre-industrial control. That's consistent with this picture here. And then the 4 times CO2 is for that same grid cell, or so the red is a 4 times CO2 experiment for that same grid cell. And it becomes, these regimes become even clearer if you change that y-axis to latent heat flux divided by the net radiation, because you see whenever that is pegged at 1, that tells you the percent of time that you're in the energy limited regime, okay, that all of the available energy is being consumed by latent heat flux. So for the PI control, the pre-industrial control, it's more than 60% of the time, whereas for the 4 times CO2, it's only about 40% of the time. So that means that 20 or 25% more of the time in this warmer world, this grid cell is seeing soil moisture limitation, which means there's big implications for temperature extremes. Okay, so that's really important, and I'm going to come back to that later. But that was for one given location, right? So we can think of that as one location, as one slice. It's one AI value and one slice. So now consolidating all those different locations into these horizontal slices allow us to see a more consolidated view of how this whole region, and the region I'm considering here is the tropics, 30 south to 30 north, okay? So this shows us that the way soil moisture is changing and the way things like latent heat flux are changing are in some ways dictated by this soil moisture latent heat flux relationship. Okay, so what we see in this is again looking at 4 times CO2 minus pre-industrial control experiments. We see the greatest drying in soil moisture. Soil moisture tends to be drying throughout the domain, except in the arid region where there's probably just not any moisture left to dry, right? But where we see the biggest the differences are along this, or biggest reductions in soil moisture are along this diagonal band, which says that the most drying is happening on dry days in moist regions down here, but it's happening on the relatively wet days in the dry regions, okay? And this line, this pink line, is a line of 20 kilograms per meter squared. So the most of the drying happens along this critical point, you know? And of course, again, as I said, there's variability in space and time of that critical point. So it's sort of just like a surrogate for, it's a loose alignment of what we think the critical point might be. So then if you look at the latent heat response, and these are normalized, this is 8 different CMIP5 models. I've normalized each one by the mean tropical ocean warming here, so that we don't, it's normalizing for different climate sensitivities of the models. So the response that we see is where latent heat flux is the largest reductions in latent heat flux are really in this transitional regime that's corresponding to where we have the most soil moisture limitation. In the wet regime, even though there's a reduction in soil moisture, there's an increase in latent heat flux. And that is because the wet regime is not soil moisture limited, it's energy limited. So as long as there's ample energy available, then you can have additional latent heat flux. Okay, and the dry regime, not much going on there in this latent heat flux picture. This active rain regime, we're going to get to later when we look at some other variables. So that will come back. We'll come back to that. But now let's look at temperature, because I mentioned temperature and that really strong connection between soil moisture limitation and daily maximum temperature. And indeed, we see that the strongest changes in daily maximum, everything is positive here, right? So it's warming everywhere. But the strongest responses are across this top band throughout the arid region. But that seems to be uniform in magnitude or close to it at all soil moisture percentiles. otherwise known, otherwise interpreted as across the whole PDF at all days, right? So this is telling us that there's a uniform shift to warmer temperatures. Whereas down here in these moist and semi-moist regions, again, there is warming. There's a warm shift, but where we see an accentuation of that warming, additional warming, is on the driest days, which are going to be the hottest days. So it's the days that are already hot are going to get even hotter. So we see a lengthening of the warm tail. And that's consistent with previous literature, including a paper that Suchin, the postdoc was the lead on these on this work. She also had this nice paper where she showed that, again, looking at those same 4 times CO2 minus pre-industrial control experiments, if you look at the mean, land warms more than the ocean, but it's dry land. So it's these most arid regions where the mean temperature change is the highest. But if you look at it, the extreme relative to the mean, it's in moist regions with smaller aridity indices where you have the greatest extension of that sort of lengthening of the warm tail. So that's nice corroboration, getting the same result from 2 different perspectives. And indeed, there's been lots of work in the past looking at these types of responses to changes in soil moisture availability. These experiments, GLASSE experiments, that stands for Global Land Atmosphere Coupling Experiment. There have been 3 different iterations of them. This was from the 3rd iteration that Sonia Seneviratne led. And there were experiments where you had a reference simulation that was fully interactive, and then using different soil moisture overrides, where essentially you say, okay, I'm not going to use that interactive soil moisture. I'm going to tell the model to look at the climatology of soil moisture, and it can be the climatological seasonal cycle. But what that effectively does, and so this is for a single grid point in Central Asia. The red is the interactive. You see the relationship between soil moisture and evaporative fraction, which is latent heat flux divided by net radiation. So it's the fraction of net radiation being used by evaporation. And you see that by creating this experimental design is essentially reducing your soil moisture PDF to just that central portion that's consistent with the climatology. And so at this grid point, we've removed all these days where they were water limited. So now you're so your climatological override puts you in a domain where there's always water, there's always moisture available for evaporation. So your evaporation goes up, your sensible heat flux goes down, and correspondingly, your temperatures are much cooler, right? So, and this was from a paper that Alexei Berg led a few years ago. And what he also showed is that surface temperature response to the soil moisture availability is location dependent. Well, this was a really very nice paper at its time, but it totally makes sense now, right? If you think of it in terms of this phase space, that construct of the experimental design sort of dictates this outcome, and it makes a lot of sense. So it's sometimes nice to go back to previous results and look at them through the lens of your new work. So another thing that we can use this phase space to look at is not just multi-model means. So this is the multi-model mean of latent heat flux change that I showed you a few slides ago. And that is built up from these 8 different climate models. These are all CMIP5 models. Again, 4 times CO2 minus pre-industrial control. And we see that, the GFDL model, the ESM2M, we see this nice diagonal drying band. And that's also true in these other models. But to differing extents, right? What this tells me is that these process regimes are present in each of the models, but they're present for different percentages of space and time. So this is, I think, a really powerful lens on model behavior. It can tell us a lot just visually right here. I know that this is a wetter model than this one. But if we take this same latent heat flux information and look at it in geographic view, in map view, it's really difficult to draw generalized conclusions. Because if you just pick a region like Australia, you see some of the models show strong drying and others, or strong reductions in latent heat flux, some show strong increases. Or if you look at the Amazon, some have strong increases, some have strong decreases. So the geographic lens on these things, it's really hard to get a systematic conclusion. But looking in the phase space, I think we can say some much more, draw some more meaningful conclusions. So, okay, these are the three up in the upper right here. These are the three variables I've talked about so far: soil moisture, latent heat flux, temperature, daily maximum temperature. What about precipitation? So let's look at these in the regime. So in the dry regime, very little change. But here's where this active rain regime really stands out. Where we see these large increases in precipitation is in the part that's already wet, the already wet part of the soil moisture PDF. So at each location, it's essentially the wettest days that are getting more rain. In the rest of the PDF, particularly in the bottom half here, so in those moist and semi-moist regions, we see substantial decreases in precipitation. So what this is telling us is that for this bottom half, for these moist and semi-moist regions, it's the wet days that are getting more rain and the dry days are getting less rain. But this isn't quite yet. I mean, I said earlier I wanted to talk about the wet gets wetter paradigm, but we're not there yet, because for that we need to look at P minus E, not just P. So that's what we're going to do now. And this is tells us something about how this wet get wetter manifests on land. That's actually not a good title, because it's really, it's just different. It's just different, right? But if we're thinking in terms of this wet gets wetter space, what that, just to remind you, that's really an amplification of the climatological P minus E. So over here, I'm showing you the pre-industrial control P minus E, and it shows you for essentially this triangle, this upper left triangle, evaporation is in excess. And for the bottom right triangle, precipitation is in excess. So if the change from this 4 times CO2 minus pre-industrial control, if the change were to be following the wet gets wetter paradigm, then everything to the right here would be an increase and everything to the left would be a decrease. And that's obviously not what we see. But we clearly do see that there's redistribution in time. So what's dictating that redistribution? Well, now I want to look at that same result, but through through the lens of these process regimes. Okay, so over here I'm showing this is the latent heat flux plot with the regimes superimposed on it. And then because this P minus E, it's P, I've put over here the two driving parts of it, the P term, and then the latent heat flux is the E term, right? So very little change up in the dry regime, but again, it's in this active rain regime where it's really, the signal is really driven by this increase in precipitation. So it's this active rain regime getting wetter, but it's the wet regime, it's actually getting drier, and that's driven by this reduction in precipitation. So there's less coming in. There's also an increase in evaporation, so there's more coming out, but really the driving force is this precipitation. But over here in this is the transitional regime, and this is where things are really quite different, right? You don't see that over the ocean, right? You don't have this water limited regime over the ocean. So what we're seeing here are positive changes. So it looks like moisture convergence, but really in a way it's actually moisture divergence. It's a reduction of moisture divergence, I mean to say. So we have a positive change that's coming out because both the precipitation, the input is getting reduced, but the output, the evaporation is getting reduced even more. So the reduction of E is greater than the reduction of P. So if we think of that in terms of climatological regime, in these moist and semi-moist regions, we're seeing the active rain regime getting wetter, the wet regime getting drier, and the transitional regime showing less moisture divergence. And then again, almost no change in the arid region. And then in these semi-arid regions, all 4 of these regimes, these process regimes are present, right? There's a little bit of the dry, there's a lot of this transitional, and maybe a hint of the wet regime. And about 5 or 10% of the time you see this active rain regime. So this really tells us something about how this wet get wetter paradigm, like maybe this is a new paradigm that to complement the wet gets wetter, which really is for oceanic purposes only. And we can think of that, you know, we can then, again, as I said earlier, it's nice to go back and look at old results through the lens of this new phase space. So again, looking at analyses that were done using these soil moisture override experiments as part of the Glacé project. Alexi Berg had another nice paper where he showed indeed that the difference between this no trend and with the trend that really the land atmosphere feedbacks help to amplify the future aridity increase over land. So land atmosphere feedbacks do matter, but it's interesting to use this phase space to think about this experimental design, as I was saying earlier, and what that tells us about the construct of the results that we're getting out of this. And those same experiments were used by Julia Green to look at carbon uptake. And she showed that indeed this soil moisture variability and trends are really important for the amount of carbon that can be taken up. And if you have more time in that moisture limited regime, that reduces the amount of carbon you can uptake. Your vegetation respond differently when they're in water limited conditions and when they're not. So again, we can use this phase space to think about these carbon related processes and these forestry related processes. And I think this would be a really powerful tool to think about carbon. Just because so much of the carbon cycle is mediated by the hydrologic cycle. We can also use this phase space to think about seasonal changes of P minus E. You know, ask the question, do the wet seasons get wetter and dry seasons get drier? And this question is at the heart of a manuscript that Xia Zhao led that's just, revisions were just submitted to Nature Communications, so hopefully that gets through. And what she showed was that, you know, you see some wet seasons, you know, so this is the P minus E changes during the wet seasons and during the dry seasons, and then the annual range. And you see that in some, the blue regions are where the ES stands for extended seasons. So where the wet are indeed getting wetter and the dry getting drier. And the red are where you have reduced seasonality, where the opposite is true. And what Xia found was that in about 45% of the area, this seasonal take on wet gets wetter does sort of hold, but there's about 20% where it doesn't. And then of course there's the, you know, the difference, right? There's a lot where it's just messier. But what's going on in these 20%, Xia shows, she uses some other soil moisture override experiments to show that this reduced seasonality is largely driven by a strong soil moisture effect during the dry season, which is entirely consistent with what we're showing with this phase space. And then she goes on to even show that it's reduced moisture convergence during the dry season, which is determining things. So entirely consistent with that those must be regions with a strong transitional regime presence. So, you know, all of that is saying that, you know, resolving daily timescales, resolving the timescales of the processes of interest is really important to characterize this land atmosphere coupling. And land atmosphere coupling is really at the heart of what we look at in the local coupling project of the GWEX glass panel. So Ankur mentioned that I'm co-chair of the glass panel, and my entry point into the glass panel was really the local coupling project, this working group where we look at this sort of a 1D column view of how soil moisture, how the land surface through soil moisture and vegetation, how that affects surface flux partitioning. Otherwise, that's what we call the land leg. And then we look at how those fluxes from the ground surface influence boundary layer growth and development and the onset of precipitation in clouds, or the potential onset of precipitation in clouds. So those are our two legs of the loco process chain. But what Zun Yin, who's currently a postdoc currently working with me on looking at diagnostics of land atmosphere coupling, what he's shown is, I mean, it's entirely consistent, again, with this phase space. And the phase space with Su Chin's work, we're showing that you need to resolve daily data to understand how soil moisture is mediating evapotranspiration and how that then plays out in all these other variables. Where Zun it's showing that, you know, if you use monthly data to try to characterize this land atmosphere coupling, you end up missing a lot of information. If you use these loco metrics are really focused, many of these metrics that we're really looking at that sort of 1D column view of how the land surface influences the boundary layer above it. And if we just map the regions of strongest coupling using the same data set, but sampling daytime only values or 24-hour entire day values or monthly data, we end up getting different answers because effectively they're asking different questions. So again, having data that are resolving the timescales of the processes of interest are really, really important. So I've been sort of dribbling into my talk here things about how we can extend. You know, this is a picture of these 5 variables in this phase space, the soil moisture aridity index percentile phase space. I think the phase space in and of itself is really a powerful tool to look at hydroclimatic connections, but we can also extend it. And one of the ways that I hope to extend it is to apply it to this, this Lighthouse activity on explaining and predicting Earth system change that I'm co-chairing with Rowan Sutton from the University of Reading and the National Center for Atmospheric Sciences in the UK. And this is a massive undertaking. It's a very ambitious idea. And the idea is that really to design it's really about designing an attribution system for decadal scale predictability. And that's an enormous task, right? That's asking a lot. So I want to focus on the language of that, but rather give a perspective of we've split it up into 3 working groups that are centered on these themes. The central theme is really about this integrated attribution, prediction, and projection. You know, can we say something about, oh, there's these decadal modes of variability in the Earth's surface, or in the Earth system rather, that have known effects on things like tropical cyclone hazards and frequencies and intensities. So can we couple our modeling and observational systems to best sort of feed into this idea of having an attribution system that's looking not just at weather scale events, but really at longer time scale horizon, and say, you know, okay, well, we're entering for Australia a period where, because of the phase of ENSO and the Indian Ocean dipole, that has big consequences for spring rain, or for tropical cyclone, the frequency of tropical cyclone landfalling in the North Pacific. Right, so these are really big questions, and we need to come up with some. I was just talking to Tristan about this. We need to come up with some case studies to make this real and bring it, give us a process to understand this and show how we can maybe look at these different forcing factors and different sources of annual to decadal variability in the climate system, and see if we can attribute any change in extremes out to these annual to decadal scales. And it's a really hard project, but what I hope to do is to use these attribution experiments in the context of this to say, okay, well, let's look now, let's use this soil moisture aridity index phase space when we're in different states of, say, different states of ENSO, or different states of the North Pacific oscillations, or North Atlantic oscillations, different modes of variability. How does that play out in terrestrial hydroclimate in Europe, right? What's going on in the North Atlantic? We know that there's phases of variability in the North Atlantic. How does that play out in hydroclimate in Europe? So that's where I hope to apply this phase space to help understand sort of bigger picture, longer time horizon variability and change. But in order to do that, we can't just use the 4 times CO2 idealized experiments, right? Those are like the biggest hammer we have to just quadruple CO2. In order to really look in terms of predictability, particularly on an annual to decadal variability and predictability, we need to be able to look at transient simulations and see if we see the same results. So we took some CMEP6 experiments where we had daily output from some SSP 2.2-4.5 projection scenarios. And you see that if I look at these 5 variables, it's very similar. It's messier, of course, because these are only 10 years. I'm looking at 2090s minus 2010s. So it's just 10-year differences. But again, 8 models in this CMEP6 multi-model composite, and what fell out of, or what emerged from the 4 times CO2 experiments is really present here as well in these future scenarios. But if we look at those same models over the historical period, comparing from 1900, from the early 1900s to the 2000s, it's a very different pattern. And what stands out most is this difference between the latent heat flux and the difference between the precipitation, right? So what's the difference here? Well, if we go back to our 5 variables that we were looking at before in the soil moisture aridity index phase space, we saw, I mentioned that, soil moisture was decreasing both in the transitional regime, but also in the wet regime. And how that plays out in latent heat flux is that you have reductions of latent heat flux where there's moisture limitation. But we saw an increase in latent heat flux when there's not moisture limitation, as long as there's an increase in available energy. So if we now just use this phase space to plot an additional variable, we can think about how that plays out in the historical. And we see that, oh, there's something going on. And Tristan, this is what I was pointing out to you that I thought you would be interested in. In the historical period for these 8 different CMIP6 models, we actually see a reduction of net radiation that is clearly driving a reduction in latent heat flux, a reduction in precipitation. And so a different manifestation, but just this phase space, just in and of itself, tells us a lot about what's going on. So now the question is, let's dig into this and look at observations and say, is that true? So that's where I want to talk to you more, Tristan. So let me just conclude now. This was my title, Land Atmosphere Interactions in the Changing Hydrologic Cycle. I've tried to say that ocean is an important driver of large-scale hydrologic change, and its influence is growing in terms of the quantities of water that's falling on land, but that we have plenty of evidence of the impact of land, the vegetation and soil moisture, and on land atmosphere feedbacks on terrestrial climate and climate extremes. And we also have we know that the impacts of soil moisture limitation will be felt more often in some regions. So even if the mean precip that the ocean is driving onto land is that may be trending in one direction, but the frequency of soil moisture limitation might be trending in another. And that's really important. I want to stress again that we need high-res data, temporally high-resolution data that describe the processes that we're trying to characterize. And this soil moisture aridity index phase space is a powerful new tool for understanding terrestrial hydroclimatic change, the relationships between variables, and how soil moisture limitation dictates many of these knock-on consequences. But so it's a powerful tool for understanding these changes, but it's also, you can use it for model development, for model intercomparisons, for model to OBS comparisons, once we have enough observational data sets that are long enough and trustworthy enough. But we can also use it to look at process studies and attribution studies and carbon and dust and vegetation and all sorts of things. I can think of all sorts of things. So I'm very excited about it. I hope I conveyed some of that enthusiasm, and with that, I will stop.
Thank you very much. Give lots of virtual applauses here. Still never the same. Rest assured.
No, it's still not the same. It's true.
Lots of support. That was a really great kind of tour de force of the way the soil moisture coupling processes really drive a lot of things. And so I like the framework a lot. So we'll open it up for questions. There's one on chat earlier from Dan Beaumont, who wrote it back to one of your earlier slides about when you're looking at the potential vegetation versus land use change scenarios. What was the potential vegetation that was prescribed there? Was it pre-industrial or pre-European deforestation?
That one was a pre-European deforestation. So yeah. So it was big changes, but where they were biggest were in those areas where the two red regions that then played out in the subsequent plot where we saw a change in hot, dry summers.
Yep. Very cool. Other questions from the audience? Raise your hand, unmute or chat. There's another one from Dan. Are current trends in those red regions consistent with the overall trends in vegetation there?
Yeah, sorry, I just I didn't mean to interrupt your talk there, and that was sort of a pedantic question, I guess. But it seemed like those regions were in regions where we're actually seeing more forestation now, which seems like in your framework might actually be a promising thing in terms of drought.
Yeah, and the other piece though that is important to consider in those regions is irrigation. All right, so models don't really account for irrigation in a good way yet. And in fact, in that model that I was showing you, deforestation, it was replacing forests with grasslands, right? We didn't have a crop model in those models. So they're not refined questions like that. You're not actually getting at real forest and agriculture questions. It's sort of, again, it's that big hammer, right? What's the sort of first order signal that we can judge?
Great, thanks.
And it clearly does show that the land surface matters, and how vegetation can influence that partitioning of available energy into sensible and latent heat flux, and that has huge consequences for temperature and humidity and all sorts of things. But to get at actual details that are, we're not doing, corn versus soy.
Yeah.
We're not there yet. But I mean, that adding a crop model to the GFDL model has, of course, been on the list for a long time, and we're getting closer. I think there's a postdoc who's coming who's starting to, I think, bring that in to have a better representation more than just C3 versus C4 grasses and trees. So.
Great, thank you very much. That was an outstanding talk. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you.
Other questions from the audience?
I see a hand up from Rudra.
Oh, go for it.
Is that a hand? Oh, no, sorry. Didn't mean to call you out. That was my cursor on your screen. That was my cursor.
That's good. I'll ask a question, although unless Rudra wants to ask a question.
I don't have a question for now, but I might join the graduate student call after that, because I have a very generic question and I'm still processing your talk. It was a very interesting talk, though. Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry to call you out there.
That's all right.
Unintentional.
If I could, give you like law school and just call on people. If I could push you a little bit about your perspective on using daily versus monthly data. Why not hourly? Because some of the things we see in some of our observations, right, is that there's often an asymmetry between soil moisture and latent heat fluxes in daytime to afternoon because of things like plants to model closure and plant stress and different cumulus clouds.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. I mean, Zun's plot, his figure, he does in the paper, he just submitted it to Hess, or a month ago submitted it to Hess. So it's on there in preprint form. You can look at it. But he shows that the biggest change is from going from monthly to 24-hour daily averages. But there is also a really substantial change in some regions from going from entire day to daytime, so 24 hours versus just daytime hours. And so now you're getting an even step beyond that, right? But what he shows is that, I mean, he documents a few process mechanisms where the nighttime processes are sort of countering what's going on in the day for different reasons. And it's not the land forcing it, it's advection. Like over in desert regions, you see a big nighttime signal because there's advection from the Mediterranean over the warm deserts, and so if you're looking at 24-hour averages, that's actually what you're capturing, not the daytime process that you're interested in. So you get a very different, get a very different coupling strength, but it's for, it's a different mechanism that you're capturing. So, and he sees some other regions where the nighttime processes sort of just contaminate if what we're trying to get at is the daytime data. I think the assumption was, entire day values, well, the daytime processes are dominant, so that will rule. But that's not always true. And what you're saying is that even, morning time versus afternoon, the actual mechanistic processes are different. And it makes sense, that the plants are still sort of waking up in the morning, right? I mean, and different plants are working in different ways too. And
yes.
I think about,
Yes, I put on the hat of my ecology colleagues, right? The way we tend to think of plants in climate models, right, kind of hides a lot of species level variation in types of optimal processes they have in plant water use, which I think influences to some extent the latent heat flux budget of surface.
That absolutely makes sense. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Your talk also got me thinking a little bit about when you mentioned like this increasing impact of oceanic precipitation on continental processes in a warming climate. And I was wondering about the other side of that too, like the downstream effects of increasing precipitation on land, increasing runoff, which influences the nutrient budget of oceans, because a lot of the limiting nutrients, right, are coming in off of the continent onto oceans and the biogeochemical feedbacks. I don't know if anyone's ever really looked at that, or if you know anything.
I don't know of studies, but I mean, I absolutely agree with you that, you know, I mean, what we're I'm sure there's observational evidence of runoff increasing, right? And it's a distribution thing again, right? You know, I think in that phase space, it clearly shows that there's a repartitioning of precip towards higher intensity events. We don't know that reduction. So it was like maybe over the top 30 percentile of days where you're seeing, you know, 10 to 30%, right? Depending on what aridity index you're at, where you have an increase in precipitation. But that means, you know, that there's 70% of the time where those are more moderate events where we don't know if it's reducing frequency or reducing intensity yet. But of course, we can look at that, and we just haven't gotten around to it yet. But what it still is saying is that more of the moisture as it's landing on the ground is going to run off, you know, and there's big consequences of that. And in fact, Xia Zhao, the one I mentioned, one of her papers, she's also working on another paper that's in review now that is looking at that you know, change in the partitioning of rainfall between runoff and the increase. What we're seeing is an increase of runoff.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I'd be interested to see what you find. Any last questions? Otherwise, I think there's a meeting with students. Okay, if not, let's give another hand to our speaker. Thank you very much for attending and kicking off our Colloquium series. And
thank you.
To see more of you at the next one. All right.
Okay, so I think